Okay, so we have 27 people on the call at the moment. So we start off now. Let me just explain the next few sessions. So we have asset and liability management. We started it last week. We have it going on for the next 4 weeks. So basically next 4 weeks, starting last week, next 5 weeks, for 5 weeks. We have three areas. One was basically the introduction area, which we did last week. This area that we are going to cover today has part of the gap analysis in it. And next week will be a bit of the duration side. So my intention today is to not go through the entire presentation that is there on what you have got printed out. My intention is to take it a bit slow and make sure that there is some understanding around this area that you have. The area that we're covering today is, like I said, on the gap analysis. So, and we will probably cover it this week and through next week as well. Unfortunately, because you are not here on a physical class, in terms of doing sums and going through it and making sure that you are aware of calculations and what is there, that is unfortunately not available. So I might ask you to go back and do some work by yourself later on. But the main intention for this is for you to understand the concept around it. And perhaps if that is the case, we can go through a little more than what we want to today. But my idea would be to try and absorb as much as we can over a period of time. We have the next few weeks, like I said, allocated for it. I think we should be able to finish the ALM bit in the next, this week, next week, and maybe one more week. I believe that Nishant has already covered some areas on duration for you already. So I'm not going to go into that again. But for the moment, let's focus on the gap area. Before that, I just want to touch on what we did last week, just to refresh our memories. We spoke about asset and liabilities. We spoke about the importance of asset and liability management, both as a risk management tool as well as a way of ensuring that there is profitability to the bank. We also looked at the Treasury's role within that asset and liability management framework. We also looked at how asset and liability management has to be coupled with the different other frameworks within the bank, like, for example, compliance, regulatory, in terms of the organization structure, everything, where asset and liability management, how important it is to have that concept and have built it in there. And then we looked at how we adopt it on a day-to-day basis. Today, what we are looking at is something called gap analysis. Now, gap analysis, we discussed gap analysis in terms a bit before when we did the treasury management piece, and when we were looking at how there is a gap between your time durations in terms of for your assets and your liabilities, and then figuring out from there where your mismatches are. So in some essence, this is similar to that. It goes into a little more detail, and it is more sort of it is a more in-depth version of what we discussed the other time. Okay, so from our objectives and overall perspective, we are looking at gap analysis. We are looking at how the reports are looked at from a gap perspective, and what needs to go into those reports, and what you need to consider when you are slotting in different items into your report, and how to handle a common sort of loan structures that you'll get in, or loan or investment products, or different products that you'll get in the bank, which are like amortizing loans and bonds with zero coupons, etc. So basically, I think what you also have to understand is, do not get caught up in the math of it too much. I think it's very important to know how the math works. But more than that, I think the concept is what you need to understand more than anything else. The concept around what is a gap, what are the limitations that there are, how it impacts the bank, how it impacts how market movements and how movements in interest rates impact that. how you should be considering it, how not only in terms of just statistically building models or statistically building different data buckets, but also to try and analyze and see, okay, what needs to go into it and why you're doing it. The math around it, as you know, it's a formula. You plug in the details. You know, you get your answer. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Definitely, you have to know what goes into it, but it is more important to understand why and on what basis you're doing whatever you're doing, because at the end of the day, it's about sorting this data into the right places with the right intentions in mind. So we are in slide 4 now. As you said, you know, at the end of this, you'll be able to define what a gap is, prepare reports, calculate where the gaps are, and look at how you compute the income from it and how you assess different products that the bank does, and how that impacts the different reports that you will have to look at if you are looking at this area. Okay, so before I get into it, we are going to take some time around this, so I'm not going to rush through this. Like I said, can somebody tell me what they understand as being a gap? What is a gap? Either by English definition or just from this on your understanding, what is a gap? When you say gap, what are we talking about here? What is gap?
We could set up a limit. Upon that limit, that could be an increase or decrease.
Okay. Don't go into that detail. Just tell me what a gap means. Just the word, the gap. What does it mean?
Simply, that is a difference.
It's a difference. So when you say there's a gap, what you're trying to say is something is not perfectly aligned or matched. There is a difference. There is a deficit, not a deficit, but there is a mismatch. Is that correct in me saying that? There is a mismatch. So when you say there is a mismatch, what are we saying here? That we are not, our business, any business that we are doing, there is no 100% alignment between left and right, or asset and liability in this case, or buying and selling. There is never a perfect alignment. Meaning, if you're selling 100, you won't buy 100. If you're selling 100 for 1 year, you're not going to buy 100 for 1 year, for example. Or you're not going to borrow 100 for 1 year to lend 100 for 1 year. So, in other words, what you have to recognize first is every organization, every bank will have a gap in their how their cash flows and how their overall cash flows will have a difference in terms of asset liability mix and the tenors and the rates and all that within that. So this is the gap analysis. This is a gap. A gap is something where if we were borrowing, very simply put, if I borrowed 100 million rupees for 1 year and I lent 100 million rupees for 1 year, both at the floating interest rate or both at fixed interest rates, do I have a gap? That's all that's on my balance sheet. Do I have a gap there? Do I have a gap? If I borrowed 100 million for 1 year, lent 100 million for 1 year, both at the same interest rate, do I have a gap there?
It amounts and you won't see a gap, but there could be a gap depending on the tenor.
No, I said 1 year. Both are 1 year. I borrow for 1 year, lend for 1 year.
No.
No. But I borrow, we'll say, 100 million for 1 year at a floating interest rate of every 3 months, and I lend for 1 year at a fixed rate of for 1 year, but I borrow floating. Still 1 year, but floating interest rate. Then do I have a gap?
Yes.
I would have a gap. Why would I have a gap there?
Because of the interest rate fluctuation.
That's right. So although my assets and liabilities are perfectly matching, because I have a 1-year commitment on a loan, I have a 1-year commitment on a deposit, all that's good. There is a gap because my rates are, one is floating, one is fixed. Yeah. So you have now a gap caused by effectively by the rates sensitive nature of the liability that you have, basically. Yeah. So gap is not only related to duration, or rather in this case, when you say duration tenor, it also comes down to how you have raised that and what are the economic conditions. When I say economic, on what basis have you raised that those assets and liabilities at? So what you got to understand is when your bank goes out and does business, it does not, it offers different kinds of products to its clients. It will offer fixed rate mortgages, it will offer fixed rate loans, it will offer floating rate mortgages, car loans, personal loans, whatever you want to call it. At the same time, it will borrow deposits paid on a monthly interest basis, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, up to whatever period, interest paid and mature. So it's creating various assets, various liabilities, various kinds of risk parameters and various kinds of risk profiles. So obviously, at one point in time, when the businesses have gone out and done this, the banks, corporate banking, personal banking, people have gone out and made this, made these businesses or made these transactions. It leaves the balance sheet looking at on a certain basis. And then when you do, then as you will find that there are gaps. ALCO, Treasury, they'll find, okay, I have a gap in my 1-year bucket, 2-year buckets, 3-year buckets. We'll get into that, but there are gaps. So the understanding of what those gaps are, and then trying to figure out how we sort of manage that gap is where we are at now, at the moment. Okay, so from a very, and like I said, it's not about going into a lot of technical details, so don't get caught up in that. It's just about understanding what are you looking at. And this is not a perfect situation. When you actually go into it and sit down, it will be more complex than this in terms of your day-to-day work. But the basic understanding around this is, the theory around it is what we are looking at now. Right. So basically, like I said, you're looking at your rate sensitive assets and your rate sensitive liabilities, right? So when I say rate sensitive is what I meant. So 100 million rupees borrowed at floating every 3 months, 100 million rupees lent at fixed for 1 year. So those are both rate sensitive assets in different ways. So when somebody says you have a positive gap, what does it mean, right? What does it mean? It basically says that you are having an asset, a loan on your book, that you have had loans on your book that exceeds the amount of liabilities that you have raised. Now, remember, we are not talking about the rate at the moment. We are talking about rate sensitive assets. So these are assets you have raised at various types of conditions like fixed, floating, interest rates, whatever, but all rate sensitive. Rate sensitive assets wise, you are having more than you have in terms of liabilities. In other words, you have more loans than you have deposits. So it's asset sensitive, right? Negative gap means liabilities that exceed assets. So basically you have more deposits than you have given out assets. So it's liability sensitive. We'll go into detail, but try to just absorb this. So positive gap is where we have more assets than liabilities. Now you can ask how that is, how will the balance sheet then, balance out, Remember, we are talking about rate sensitive assets here, right? So you are talking about where you have raised assets or you have given out loans more than you have paid interest and taken deposits. Maybe you have current account deposits which are not, or you may have more equity, or you may have something else that plugs in the basis on which you have given out more assets, Yeah, but what this is trying to tell you is, when you look at your whole balance sheet, you have more assets that are sensitive to rate movements than you have liabilities that are sensitive to rate movements. And then on the other side, you have more liabilities, the negative gap, you have more liabilities that are subject to rate movements than you have more assets that are subject to rate movements. So in other words, it's just not telling you that you have a disproportionate amount of assets and liabilities. He's saying that the assets and liabilities, when you consider it from a sensitivity to market rates, positive gap is where you have more assets that are uh, more rate sensitive than you have liabilities. Negative gap is where you have more liabilities that are rate sensitive than you have assets. Is that clear? Okay. So
Yes, sir.
one question here is, why are you doing this? One of the reasons you have, like we discussed, is to manage your cash flows, all that fine. But why is the other reason you're doing this? Why are you worried about rate sensitivity to assets? Why are you worried about rate sensitivity to your liabilities? I mean, if you have assets and liabilities on your book, why are you worried about whether you have more rate sensitive assets or what's the reason? Why are you so concerned about it? Okay, I'll answer the question for you. The basic reason is that, remember, just because you get a deposit and put it on your books and you give a loan and put it on your books, the story doesn't end there. The world is moving with you. The markets are moving with you. Monetary policy is changing. Interest rates are changing. Constantly you have transactions happening outside, even if the, say, central bank doesn't increase or decrease interest rates, or if there's no drastic monetary change, market rates keep moving, market interest rates keep moving, yield curves keeps changing, all kinds of activities always happening. And then, like I mentioned before, when we discussed this, there's liquidity as well. So there are concerns in terms of, if you have certain rate sensitive assets in certain liabilities in certain buckets, then you wonder, okay, will I get this liquidity back? How much more interest rates will I have to get this deposit back? Yeah. So there are always concerns coming in like that. Right? When those concerns come in, what happens to you? Yeah, you need to know where your sensitivities are, where your risk points are, and then decide, okay, I have more recessive assets, so what do I do about it? How do I make sure I reduce my risk, or am I happy with the risk that I have? Yeah. If rates go like this asset book is going to be X amount in money, X amount of out of money, right? I need to figure out what do I need to do to reduce the positive gap I have, or maybe I'm happy to increase it some more, maybe, I don't know, right? Or increase my liabilities to match the assets that I have, yeah, so that my gap becomes neutral. So something like that. So you need to understand the rate sensitivity to make sure that you are making decisions that will save the bank from losing money in the future. So like I said, this is not only a risk management tool, this is very much a tool towards ensuring shareholder profitability, the firm's profitability and the shareholder profitability. So that is why we are looking at positive gaps, negative gaps, and what all about these gaps, because of this reason. So look at this chart on slide number 6. Here we are looking at basically the same thing we discussed before, but it's just summarizing for you what it means. So let's look at the first column or the second column. What's a positive gap? Like I said, asset sensitive. You have more rate sensitive assets than you have rate sensitive liabilities, right? So what does it mean? That means your assets are repricing faster than your liabilities. Okay. which basically means you have short-term assets funded with long-term liabilities. Yeah. So first understand that before we go to the effects of interest rates. What do we mean here? What's an asset? Just ask a simple question. What's an asset? For a bank, what's an asset? What is an asset? Okay, simple question. Don't overthink it. What's an asset for a bank? What's an asset?
That is basically loan.
A loan, exactly. So when we say asset is repricing on a short-term basis, what does it mean? So what does it mean? Now, banks give out loans, like I said, for various periods, right? 1 month, 2 months, overnight, 1 week, 5 years. When you say the asset is repricing on a short-term basis, short-term assets rather, under the long term. What do you mean by short-term assets?
Loans given less than 1 year.
Yes, correct. It could be, yeah, definition usually short-term would be less than a year. So what it means is when you have a positive gap, you have a lot of short-term assets funded with a lot of long-term liabilities. So in other words, you have lent out short-term 3 months, 6 months, we'll say even 1 year, and then you have borrowed long-term. So you have borrowed 3-year deposits, 5-year deposits, 4-year deposits, whatever period. Now, why would you do that generally? Why would you, if it's a strategy that you have employed, why are you doing that?
We expect that the future interest rate will increase.
Exactly, that's right. So what you're doing here, you have expectation that your interest rates will increase in the future. Correct. So because you're expecting interest rates to increase, what are you saying? I would like to park all my assets or my funds that I have in short-term investments. I'm not going to lend out for longer term. Fine. But at the same time, because I expect interest rates, I would like to go out and borrow long-term. Yeah, I would like to borrow 5 years, 4 years. So I'll go and pay my depositor a little extra money, a little extra interest, and sort of get more long-term deposits. So now you're sitting on 5-year deposits with a lot of short-term assets. Now, sometimes it's also not about, I'm just deviating a little bit from the thing, but I'll explain something to you. Sometimes it's also not about interest rates, although it doesn't mention it here. It is also about liquidity. So sometimes when you feel that you need to raise liquidity because of a funding issue that you might have in the long run, because of market liquidity, again, then you will go out and pay a premium and borrow long-term liabilities, long-term deposits. And when you deploy your assets, you will also discourage lending out money for a short, long term. You will also only lend out short term. Now, that is not because of a view on interest rates. Sometimes it does translate to interest rates, but it is more to do about strengthening your balance sheet. So that also could cause a situation where you could have a positive gap, but that's not based on interest rate views. That's based on liquidity and funding requirements that might be coming up in different periods of time. So for example, if you look back, I think I used this example before. A few years ago, there were banks paying 15%, 20% interest rates to borrow deposits, right? And borrow money from their depositors. Now, yes, you could argue that they were at some point expecting interest rate to go up further, but at that point, my understanding or my personal view was most banks wanted the liquidity long term in their books. They didn't want to have a situation at that time where they were short the liquidity, where the depositors would come, put the money for 3 months, take it out, go to another bank. So they wanted to lock in their depositors for longer term, even at the higher interest rate, even if they didn't believe rates were going to go up further, they wanted to make sure that they have the liquidity locked in. Yeah. So that's just something outside for you all to understand as well. So like you said, if there is an increase in interest rates when you have a positive gap situation, you will lead to an increase in NII because your assets are getting priced at the higher rate and your liabilities are all locked in. A decline in rates would mean a reduction in NII. Yeah. Now, whether that reduction is a loss or not will depend on how much it reduces from where you have raised your liability. So if you have fixed your rates and paid your depositors, say 10%, and then interest rates keep coming down, and suddenly you find that 10% is being valued at 5% now, then you're going to have a loss. But if 10% and the rates are at 11, 12, you might still not have a loss, but you definitely give up on your NII, which is basically meaning your profitability comes down. Is that part clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the negative cap is the opposite of that. Basically, it's liability sensitive. Liabilities are repricing before assets. So basically, what have you done here? You have raised short-term deposits, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it might be, and you have lent your money more longer term. So you are raised more longer. Maybe you have, when you say lent, you could have bought long-term bonds. You could have basically given project financing. Whatever the form of the asset, you have basically created a long-term assets that are funded with short-term liabilities. Opposite of that, an increase in interest rates lead to a reduction in NII, decline in interest rates lead to an increase in NII. Now, here, this is a typical sort of situation that you will find a lot of companies or organizations do this because of the shape of the yield curve, not only because of the view of interest rates. So when I say shape of the yield curve, if you look at a typical yield curve, it will be. Can you see the board? Is the board clear or not?
Can see.
Okay. So a typical yield curve will be like this. Right. So basically, what you're saying here is this is 10%, this is 15%, right? And you're basically, as you go up the tenor, so this is for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc. Right? So as you go up, you will find that the yield curve, interest rate, whatever that rate is, keeps trending up. So what are you saying here? You're saying here, today, if I were to lend money for 1 year, I will get 10%. For 2 years, I'll get 15%. For 3 years, I'll get 20%. So now, he might think, let me, whatever his view on interest rates are, maybe like it said, his view on interest rates will be that the interest rates will come down in the future. Even if the view is, for example, that interest rates will remain static, interest rates will not change, he might still like to go for a negative gap situation. Why do I say that? I'm saying the view is not that interest rates will go down and therefore lead to an increase in NII. I'm saying the view is that interest rates will remain the same, but he still want to go for a negative gap situation. Why is that? You all understand the question?
So can you repeat the question?
Yes. So what I'm trying to say is, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is this: What's a negative gap? A negative gap is where you have more long-term assets and short-term liabilities, meaning you have created more long-term loans than you have borrowed, and you have borrowed short-term deposits. Yeah, simple as that. Now, when would you do that? When you expect interest rates to come down in the future. Yeah, where you are thinking, okay, interest rates are going to come down, so I'm going to give my loans at a higher rate now, and then keep on borrowing short term so that I raise my money when it's continue to raise my money when interest rates are relatively low. But my point is, this is the yield curve in the market now. This is what you see. This is 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 10%, 15%, 20%. Yeah, percentage and years, right? So my point I'm trying to tell you is, okay, this guy, we don't have a view on, we don't believe interest rates are going to go up, or we may believe interest rates might go up marginally, or we believe interest rates might be flat, not do anything, just be at this current level. Say the overnight level we say is 5% here currently, right? This is the overnight level. So we believe interest rates are going to be at 5%. But this guy goes out and said, okay, I believe interest rates are going to be flat. I'm going to have a long-term view on that it's going to be flat, and I'm going to basically create a negative gap situation on my books. Why is that? Now, he doesn't believe interest rates are going to come down, but he's still happy to create a negative gap situation. Why is that? This is the yield curve you get in the market. These are the rates you get in the market. Why would you want to still create a negative gap situation?
Because he has borrowed previously, he has borrowed funds more than that interest rate, more than 5%.
No, assuming that this is the first transaction he's going to do. Just take example. You can see this, right? Overnight is 5%, 1 year is 10%, 15% for 2 years, 20% for 3 years. So think of it this way, right? Now let me explain. He doesn't believe 5% is going to change. He still believes 5% is going to be 5% for the next few years. But he can buy an asset that's paying him 20% in 3 years, correct? Agreed or not? He can buy a bond, we'll say, that pays him 20% for 3 years, annualized. That you all understand? You can go to the market today and buy a bond for 20% for 3 years. You all understand that?
Yes.
Yeah, so he can buy a bond. So today, overnight rates are 5%. Now, what is his view? What did I say his view was? What does he believe interest rate? Does he believe interest rates will come down below 5%?
No.
No. What does he believe interest rates will do?
Still remain.
Remain the same. Okay. He believes interest rates won't come down. He believes interest rates will remain the same. So what does he do? He goes and creates a negative gap by buying more long-term assets. Why is he doing it? Because he's buying an asset at 20%. This is his asset, yeah? 20%, 3 years. And he's creating a liability at 5%, was we'll say overnight. Now, Does he have a negative gap? Yes or no? Does he have a negative gap? Does he have a negative gap? He has more long-term assets because he has created, we'll say, he has all short-term liabilities and he has all long-term assets. So therefore, he has a negative gap because he has more long. There's a mismatch, right, in his tenors. Still 100 billion or whatever the amount, but it still has a mismatch. So he has more long-term assets and he has short-term liabilities. Is that clear? So he has a negative gap. Agree that he has a negative gap. Is that correct? You all agree that he has a negative gap.
So it's a positive gap, right?
So it's a negative gap because he has more long-term assets. Positive gap is when he has more short-term assets.
Okay, sir.
So he has long-term assets, 3 years, 20% he has assets. Overnight liabilities, which is deposits, he has at overnight. So he has short-term liabilities, long-term assets. He has created a negative gap because now he has to fund these assets with short-term deposits. If the rate goes up, what happens to it? If the rate goes up, what happens to it? This 5% goes up to 6%, then what happens? At the moment, he has 15%, right? Positive 15%. Agreed? Agreed?
Yes.
Is that right? He has a positive interest income of 15%. Correct or not?
Correct.
Okay. So if it goes up to 6%, what happens then?
That is reduced to 14%.
14%. So his NII comes down. Yeah. So he has to be sure about his view on interest rates. Now his view is interest rates are not going to change. He doesn't believe interest rates are going to come down, nor go up. It's going to change. So now, does he still create a long-term asset book? Does it still create a negative gap? Yes or no? Does he still do this? He doesn't believe this is going to happen, neither does he believe it's going to come down. Does he still create the 20% asset?
Yes.
Why does he do it?
Until it comes to 20%, he's having a net margin in the.
That's right. So it all comes down to the shape of this curve. It all comes down to what your yield curve is. Okay. So for example, if your yield curve was like this, yeah, where you had the rates at 10% for 1 year for flat yield curve, 2 years and 3 years. Yeah. If the yield curve was the same flat yield curve, not 20% but 10%, would he still do it? Because he can only get this 3-year asset now at 10%, not at 20%. Would he still do it? Maybe, I don't know. But what you got to understand is that whether you create a long-term asset funded by short-term liabilities also has a lot to do not only with your view on short-term interest rates, it has a lot to do with at what rate you can deploy your funds. So in other words, the shape of the curve. So you'll find a lot of the people who trade in the bond market, primary dealers and banks who are primary dealers would basically buy a long-term asset, say at now of course rates are very low, but maybe 7-8% they would buy a bond or whatever it is, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and fund it on short term by borrowing in the repo market. Why? Because they have a positive NII by doing that. Yeah. So if they have, that could be because their view on interest rates is that interest rates will come down, but it also could be that even if they expect interest rates to move up slightly, like in this case to 5% to 6%, they still believe owning an asset at 20% will give them enough of buffer, and that rates will not get to this 20% rate in the next 3 years. So for them, having that positive asset on the book, even if they feel interest rates will be flat or that interest rates will go up first slightly, still might make sense. So theoretically, what you're saying here is 100% correct. Interest rates leads to a reduction in NII if interest rates increase in a situation where you have negative gap. But conceptually, it comes down to where the assets are raised at as well. So that is something that you all have to understand. Is that clear? I am happy to go through it again if you are not.
So now, small question.
Yes, please.
Positive gap. The positive gap in the sense that is asset sensitive. That means you lend short term, but borrowed could be
yes.
long term.
Correct. That's right.
But when it comes to negative gap,
Yeah.
you said that there could be more long term assets.
That's correct.
But again, it says negative gap means lend long term, but borrow short term.
Yes, so positive assets, long term.
Okay. Yes. Okay. More long term in the sense, yes. More long term asset in the sense, lend long term. Correct.
That's exactly it. So that's why I asked asset. Basically, the concept has to be clear. Asset is a loan. So when you lend out long term assets, means you're creating more long term loans.
Now current scenario, by looking at the current scenario, like its interest rates are very low.
That's
then
right.
What do you think this kind of scenario, what sort of gap is it bank need to maintain? Is it positive or negative?
Oh, very good question. Very good question. So basically, if you are looking at right now, at the moment, you have a situation where interest rates are very low, like you very rightly said. Yeah. So it means that, for example, if you take, not sure where the long-term rates are, but basically, if you take, say, 5% and say 10% here, our rates are between this, currently between our rates are been somewhere here. This is where our curve is. So our curve is like a curve could be something like this. Right. So basically, the 1 year treasury bill is little bit below 5%, and then you will find, I don't think it's even close to here. I would say something like this. So yeah, this is around 9, 8, 7, 6. So our rates are somewhere here at the moment. So in other words, is this curve steep? Is this a steep curve? How would you define this interest rate curve right now? How would you define this interest rate curve? So this is it, 1 year, here, 2 year, here, 3 year, here. Not exactly, but somewhere there. I mean, actually, it could be less than this also. What kind of curve is this?
Flat curve.
It's flat, marginally steeping. Steep. It's not exactly flat. It's like there is a slight steepness. It's not extremely, steeping. So what it means is, like, to answer your question, if you believe, comes back to your view on interest rates firstly, right? If you believe interest rates are going to push up fast, yeah, then you should be raising a lot of long-term. You should be raising a lot of long-term assets, right? So meaning you have to basically look at long-term liability, which basically means you have to look at a positive gap. Where basically you will try and lock in your long-term liabilities on your book at the lowest possible rate. So in other words, if you can raise 4-year money at, we'll say, 6%, 4 years, yeah, and you believe that interest rates are going to go up for that majority of that 4-year period, be above 6%, then you should be looking at raising liabilities, raising deposits at the 6% rate, right? At the same time, if you believe that rates are the same view, because your view can't change based on whether it's asset or liability. That's very, very clear. Your view has to be a view. The view that interest rates are going up or down. So based on that, you model your assets liability mix. Now, what are you saying? Interest rates are going up in the future. If interest rates are going up in the future, then you say, okay, fine, I'm going to raise my deposits at 4 years at 6%. Am I going to lend money at 5% for 6% for whatever at 4 years then as well? I would rather lend short term till the rates pick up and my view is right. So I would raise a positive gap situation, right? And I would sit on it. Now, there are different schools of thought on this, right? The few things that you got to look at. You got to look at how the shape of the curve is. Now, if this rate was 5% here, and then the long-term rate was here, say we'll say 12%, 4 years. Now, would I still do that? Would I go out and raise money at 12%?
No.
Yeah. Unless, like I said earlier, you feel there's going to be a liquidity issue, and even raising at 12% and attracting deposits at 12% is still good. I won't be running out there to raise deposits at 12%. But at these current rates, raising at 6% for 4 years, fine, might be okay. Now, the problem is, practical problem again, is who's going to give you 4-year money at 4%, at 6%? Do you think as bankers, it is easy to go out there and tell a deposit, look, I have a very good interest rate, it's 6% for 4 years. Come and put your money. Do you think people will do it in Sri Lanka?
No.
Exactly. So now then you have to decide, if I want to raise this, do I have to slightly pick it up a little bit more to get it? And even if I find this attractive, do I have products in the market that I can go out there and raise this money at, or raise these funds at? Yeah. But from a strategy perspective, just to answer your question, if your view that interest rates are going to go up because it's very low now, then you should be raising long-term deposits and keeping your assets on a shorter term. If your view that interest rates are going to stay flat where it is now, then you look at the shape of the curve and then decide for yourself, is it worthwhile me paying a premium? And if I can attract deposits, still going and raising the assets, or do I just raise short-term liabilities to short-term and give out assets short-term? Now, if you take the view that the current rates and this is not worth me paying, I can't get deposits at this rate, what I would then do is borrow short-term assets and borrow short-term liabilities and have a more neutral asset book gap, then I would be either negative or positive. I would be more inclined to be sort of neutral on my assets and liabilities at the moment. But ideal is to borrow here at the right price.
If my view is interest rate going down,
Yep.
I would keep short-term liability, that means deposit.
If your view is interest rates are going down, that's right. You will keep short-term liabilities, correct.
And you said it's better to maintain neutral assets, but like what are the products available for do so? Like in the neutral assets?
Now what I'm trying, because you're saying interest rates are already very low.
Yes.
So if your view is, what you're saying is, what you said just now is, if interest rates are going down, you believe it's going down, what you said is right. But if you believe interest rates are very low now, right? But you don't think it's going to go up in a hurry also, or it's going to come down in a hurry, then you rather leave a neutral position, right, at this current yield curve. Because if you had a situation where you believe interest rates are flat, not going to go up or down, and the 4-year rate was here, yeah, what would you do then? You'll actually go out there and lend money at this rate. You'll create a negative gap. You create an asset, right? If you believe interest rates are going to basically stay here, and the difference between here and here is very small, right? And you're not very sure where the interest rates are going, you will then go and raise money at this rate. You can borrow money at this rate. You create liabilities. You create a positive gap here, because this is very attractive, and you're not, if in case interest rates go up, you're hedged against that risk here, because you have borrowed long-term liabilities. Yeah. Now, if you are saying if this is here and these rates are here, you don't believe the rates are here, but you can't raise deposits here because people are not willing to come and give you deposits at these rates, and your view is interest rates could be anything, you're not sure, then you rather have assets and liability mix here, where you don't want to lend, you can't get this rate. You're basically rather say, okay, fine, let me just keep my gap less, no positive, no negative, just as much as possible, maybe a little more to the positive side, but I'd rather be more neutral than positive or negative. All depends on where this is, where these rates are, and your view.
Okay. That means like if interest rates are going to keep hold back like for 2-3 years like this, like bank could earn much. Like,
if interest rates are going to be at the same levels, is it that's what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So if interest rates are going to be at the same level, so I'm trying to understand your question. If you are saying that interest rates are going to be here for a long 2-3 year period, yes? And what does the bank do is assets. Now, bank has basically raising liabilities here. Deposits at 5% short term. What are you saying the bank is going to do with the assets? Are they going to take the long term here, or what are they going to do with the assets?
Yes.
Or what are they going to do? Are they going to lend it long term or keep it short term also?
They're going to.
Yeah.
They're going to. They're going to like lend.
Yes. Short or long term?
Short term.
Yeah. Okay. So fair enough. So it all depends on the shape of the curve. If interest rates are 5% overnight, and we say the 3-month Treasury bill is at 6%, the 6-month Treasury bill is at 6.5, and say the 1-year Treasury bill is at say 7%, You believe interest rates are going to stay here or maybe go down a bit. What do? You continue to borrow long overnight and lend here, lend here, and lend here. Is that clear?
Yes.
And then you will make money. If interest rates go up, right? Remember, you
Yes.
created an asset for 3 months. Now you're funding that with a rate that's going up. So you lose money if interest rates go up. Yeah, but you're doing this because you don't want to create maybe the 7% is for 12 months, and maybe the 2-year bond is only 7.2 or 7.3. You don't feel worthwhile is buying for a good enough rate to put your assets to hold. So you keep it. Yes, you will make money if that happens like that. If the rates go up, then yes, you're going to lose money. If the rates remain the same, you're fine.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions? Is that clear? Yeah, because we can't move on without that understanding, basically. Okay, good. Let me then go to the okay. So basically, cumulative gap. So basically, what it means is the gap for the one period, the period that we are looking at, how you calculate it. So basically, what you're saying is, no, sorry, up to the period you are looking at, how you calculate it. So it's a mathematical thing where you look at what the gap is in the period for that particular period, plus the accumulation up to that point in time. You will understand it when we go through the formula. Okay, so data needed for preparing a gap analysis, right? So the data points we require for a gap report is the basic things that you can get from a bank's balance sheet or data that you have from your cash flow statements. It's a static report. It's for a particular day. You need to get the balance sheet as at the particular day that you're looking at, and you need to get whatever off-balance sheet items that might be there that the bank has a contingency liability for. This is giving you sort of an understanding of how your cash flows and your assets liability mix will look at as at a future date or as at future dates, right? And we need to look at this gap report so that it can be incorporated into your business plans, your future allocations into your assets, your future liability strategies, and any future hedges that you're going to put on the book. So what it's basically telling you is look, what you're saying is, look, give me your balance sheet, give me all your off-balance sheet items, let's put it all together and see what we can do today with your assets and liabilities for the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever. And this is the plan we're going to have for that based on that. That's basically what it's trying to show you. So it's a MI and a management tool for us to get a grip of what the actual situation is. So how do you go about this? So basically, you would create a series of time buckets, right? And then you say, when you say time bucket, you say 1 month, 1 month to 3 months, or 1 month to 2 months. So you will decide how many buckets you need and what the length of those buckets are. So for example, you could have 1 to 3 months, you could have 3 to 6 months, or you could have 1 and 2 months, or 3 and 6 months, 3 and 4 months. Every month, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, up to you. And then basically slot your assets and liabilities based on their maturity periods into those particular buckets. And then you compute the gap and compare it with other measures. So think of it this way. Can I ask a simple question? If you are creating a report today and you need to create this analysis of what kind of gaps you have in your balance sheet, in your assets and liability mix, what should you look at in terms of your own profile first? To determine these based on what is here on this slide, number 9, what would you, there are certain things that you need to decide. This is just a very generic overview, but there are certain things you need to decide. How would you make those choices? What would you do? Now, for example, point number 1, determine the number of time buckets. How would you decide on the number of time buckets?
Basically, you need to look at the maturity profiles of the assets and the liability.
That's right. Correct. So when you say maturity profiles, what do you mean?
That could be 1 month, 2 months, likewise 1 year, 2 year, deposits or liabilities.
Exactly. So based on whether you have created assets and liabilities up to 5 or 10 years, your buckets could be extended up to 5 or 10 years or below that or whatever it is. So yes, correct. So you look at the number of buckets based on your maturity profile. And then again, determine the length of each bucket. What does that mean? So you've established that you have assets and liabilities up to 5 years. Fine, good. Now, how do you, and then you have X number of buckets you want to create. But how do you determine the length of buckets? Is it 1 to 3 months, 1 to 2 months, 1 to 6 months? How do you determine that?
Basically, by looking at your portfolio.
Okay.
If there are more, if there are more 1 month or 3 months or 1 year deposits, like based on that, you need to decide the length of bucket.
That's correct. 100% right. So you will find that a lot of profiles will have a good deal of buckets in the short term, like 1 to 3 months, 1 to 6, whatever. There'll be a lot. And then as it goes to the longer term part, you will find length gets widened more. So it's like 3 to 5 years, 2 to 3 years, or something like that. It doesn't get, you don't get 3 to 3.5 years, or even 3 to 4 years sometimes is not there. Right? So because the typical maturity buckets are short term, at least in Sri Lanka, you don't get many long-term assets, long-term liabilities created compared to the short term. Everybody would like to keep their asset mix, liability mix as neutral as possible because of the uncertainty around the interest rate environment. And most people will keep a very lower maturity profile than have a lengthier maturity profile or length of buckets. Yeah. Okay. So then 100%. So you basically do that, and then you slot your assets and liabilities into the respective buckets, and then you compute the gap and compare it with other measures. So slide number 10, it tells you exactly what we've just discussed. It depends on the composition of the balance sheet, the purpose of that, and generally it says 5 to 12 buckets, but that is, totally up to you and what you wish to do. But that's a typical sort of guideline. Like why? Because if you go on to too few buckets, it doesn't give you a meaningful sort of so if you go with 3 or 4 buckets, it doesn't really tell you anything, and it doesn't give you the granular, detailed information you need to make decisions. If it's too much of buckets, it's like it becomes very difficult to interpret and not relevant. So, for example, why I said to 3 to 5 years, for example, right? You might have most of your deposits. You might, like, if you have a deposit, if you have, say, a liability profile of 100 million, you might have only 10 million sitting in your 5-year bucket or 3 to 5 year bucket. But you going in and trying to get, I have 2 million in 3 years, another this, it doesn't really make sense. So it's much better to couple it all up, because the importance to it in the whole scheme of your total assets or liabilities in this sense is very small. So you have to make that judgment, but it has to be in a way that you sort of, the relevance of it has to be also looked at, so that you have the right amount of buckets chosen to give the right information and make the right interpretations. Going into a bit of detail there as well. Steps to in preparation of a gap. So again, same thing what we discussed. Short term, narrower buckets. Like I said earlier, you have it more compressed, more narrow, so that you give more detail, because most of the asset liabilities are usually in the short term, and the wider term for the longer term, like we just discussed. So basically, you have 1 week, 1 month, 1 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, 7 to 1 year. It all depends on you, but this is just sort of a guideline for that. Slide number 12. Yeah, so again, another guideline. Doesn't mean you have to stick to this, or depends on the type of liability and as the balance sheet structure that you have, but another guideline. So we're going step by step. So you have slotted every item into the gap. Now, step number 4. Compute the gap as the difference between assets and liabilities. So in other words, you have your assets for 3 months, your liabilities for 3 months. You look at the gap there. So you have an asset, we'll say 3-month assets of 100 and 3 months liabilities of 50. So there you have your assets exceed your liabilities by 50. So your asset positive there on the 3 months. So for the 3 months, your asset positive, which basically means you're a negative gap on 3 months. That's only for 3 months. I'm just saying you have to look at a cumulative level. But for the 3-month bucket, you're asset positive, which basically means you are negative gapped on that one. You have lost fewer liabilities in the 3-month bucket than you have assets. So for each period, you will have a series of things to show you what your gap for each of the tenors are. And then at the end of it, you will have your cumulative gap to say each of the periods, say 3 months, 6 months, whatever, it will come down and you will have a cumulative gap figure. And that cumulative gap you can compare against your total assets, your assets that earn you, or liabilities that earn you, pay interest at. You can basically compare against all kinds of ratios, so that you come up to say, okay, my gap that I have as a percentage of the assets that total assets of my book, interest bearing or non-interest, is this much. Or what it is against my total liabilities is this much. So those ratios you can make by looking at the individual and cumulative gap figures. Now, the type of assets and liabilities you include can be twofold. So the interest earning assets and interest bearing liabilities, or all assets and liabilities. So what would a typical non-interest paying liability be for a bank? If you're going to include all your liability, what would a non-interest paying liability be?
PT.
What would a non-interest paying liability be? What's the most common non-interest paying liability for a bank?
Current accounts?
Exactly, current account. So the question here is, you can either go and add into this gap analysis you're doing. You can either add all your interest-bearing liability, interest-bearing liabilities only, or you can have interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing liabilities as well, right? And then you determine where that sits. Sometimes current accounts will be more overnight because you can take it out anytime. It's sitting in the account. So it could be more overnight, that you have more liabilities overnight, but they could be less rate sensitive because it's sitting in an overnight and you're not paying interest rate. There's no rate sensitivity there. And then basically the assets are the same, but there are very few assets that the bank will have that don't bear interest, almost everything, except for money that would sit in the central bank, where that would be non-interest bearing for the bank. If by any chance it has not deployed its overnight surplus funds into a repo or a likewise instrument, that would be non-interest bearing, and therefore there will not be a income for that. So the question is, either you include only the interest-bearing assets and interest-bearing liabilities, or you include all assets and all liabilities. But the main thing to understand is there has to be consistency. Whichever way you go, assets and liabilities, you have to take the same approach throughout. You can't have, the assets that are bearing interest but not the liabilities, or vice versa. It has to be consistent, and it has to be consistent through the whole series of your gap, basically, that you take. So we'll take a break after this. We'll just do this last bit till slide number 19, and then we'll take a break. But there's a question here, 16. Now, the question is, where do you include asset or liability in your when you are to allocate, right? So there are different ways. Now we look at the question. Question number 1: 5-year floating rate bond with a coupon of 6 months LIBOR. So what's the maturity of the bond?
Five years.
When is the interest calculated on it or repriced?
Biannually.
Biannually. Then we have the second one, a bond with the original maturity of 5 years, fine, and remaining maturity of 6 months. Okay. Okay. So where would you put the 5-year bond in terms of the asset side of the book?
Six months. Like.
Why would you put it in 6 months?
If the interest rate is floating.
Yes, but the asset is on your book for 5 years, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes.
Asset is on your book. So you created a 5-year asset, correct?
Yes.
So in other words, you have a 5-year asset with a pricing that's 6 months. Okay,
6 months.
let's do the second question. We'll come back to that one. Bond with a maturity of 5 years and remaining mature 6 months. Where would you put that?
That is for 6 months.
That is for 6 months. Why? Because that has only 6 months to go.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. But for the 5-year one, remember, you have created a 5-year asset. Yeah. So ideally to slot that, yeah, you will need to see based on the is it a it's a coupon bond, right? It's a 6 month coupon. So in other words, it's not a zero coupon bond. You are not getting paid annually. You are getting paid, say, semi-annually, X amount of interest for that. Yeah. But it's a 5-year asset. So ideally, you will need to see the duration on that bond to determine what exactly is the bucket it should sit at based on the repayment schedule it has. But in this case, it should sit on your 5-year assets, basically. Because you've created a 5-year asset. Whether it's floating interest rates or not, you've created a 5-year assets. 5-year asset now. Second one for 6 months. You'll understand, we'll go to the next one. So, for example, where do you slot these items? Remaining maturity is 2 months, repricing maturity is 6 months, original maturity is 5 years. Where would you put that particular bond?
Month.
2 months.
2 months, because it has only 2 months to mature. Exactly. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is when you're slotting it, you slot the principal amount in the appropriate bucket. So basically a loan of 1 million, you slot the 1 million loan into the bucket that where the money has to come back to you at, if it's an asset that you create. So I'll stop there for the moment. What you have to understand is this: when you are, what we've discussed so far is the creation of a report and understanding what a gap is and how you basically will have to allocate your data based on the profile of your balance sheet. But main thing to understand is that the gap analysis that you do and the strategy that you take in terms of asset liability mix revolves around what happens with interest rates and your view on how the interest rates will, and also based on your view on the shape of the yield curve as well. But whether you are over a positive gap or a negative gap will determine very much on a certain point in time with the current mix of assets and liabilities you have as well, so that you can make a choice on how you go about profiling yourself. Okay, we'll take a break there, and then we'll come into the loan and the loan repayment part as well. Yeah? Okay, so morning session so far we've discussed we discussed what gap analysis is. We've discussed how you look at a gap analysis and then determine whether you are positive gapped or negative gapped. We've discussed the fact that all your asset allocation and your liability management or liability generation will be depending on your view on interest rates and also based on your the shape of the yield curve and your expectations there on of that. And then we discussed how to slot your various assets and liabilities based on your maturity profile, your balance sheet, your maturity profile. We discussed that to have an efficient sort of analysis of the gap, you need to make sure that you have the right amount of buckets with the right length of maturities on them. And then based on that, basically create a profile and have accumulation of the gap so that you decide on exactly where at a portfolio level what your gap analysis is. So in other words, what you would have is you will have your assets, you have your liabilities, You will have, we'll say, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, or we'll say 24 months, 36 months, yeah? And then you'll have assets here of say 100, liabilities of 50, assets here of we'll say 50 and liabilities of 50. And then you'll have assets here we say of 150 and liabilities of another 100. And then we will have say 50 here, and you might have liabilities of 100 here. And then you have 100 and say 150 here. So then you will calculate to see, okay, you have more assets here, you have your neutral here, you have more liabilities here, you have more assets here, and you have more liabilities here. Correct. You have more assets here. Yeah. Then you will look at all this and come up with a number saying, look, you're cumulatively your gap is 150 minus 50, so it will be 100. So in other words, you have 100 assets above your liabilities on a cumulative basis, yeah, which is basically mean you are overbought on your assets, which basically means you are a positive, you're a negative gap. In other words, you have more invested in your assets than your liability mix for the same period when you take the whole portfolio for that particular period. And then you can also identify where exactly that major portion of that asset allocation is. It's in the 12-month bucket. Sorry, I made a mistake. It should be minus. So if that's the case, you actually 0. So in other words, you have a neutral position. But you can also see, although you're neutral, at each bucket where your asset and liability mix is. So you might be happy having more assets here, or you might not be happy. So you might decide, okay, I'll move my 12 months to my 36 months and still keep a neutral position. You can even make that decision. But that's the reason you look at it from a structural perspective. You look at it from an overall perspective, rather than just taking the cumulative figure and looking at it. Because the cumulative figure will only give you this number, which are you're neutral, your assets and liabilities are fine. But in reality, you realize you have more assets here and you have more liabilities here. You might decide, look, I'm not happy with this. I want to shift some of my, I want to keep neutral, that's fine. But I want to shift some of my liabilities upwards, because I believe interest rates are looking to basically go down further. So I want to shift some of my liabilities down. And I want to shift from my assets further out, because I believe interest rates are going down. So I want to lock in more assets in the interest rate on that side. So even though it comes up like this, you can still have a very decent picture as to what your asset liability mix is for that particular category. And then, like I said earlier, you have to think of whether you're putting only your interest-bearing assets and liabilities, or you're putting the whole mix in. Is that clear? Okay. So that's basically where we stopped it. Now we're going into how how to analyze amortizing loan. So what is amortizing? First, the words. What does amortizing mean?
Amortizing in the sense loan is divided into among their repayment period. Like
That's right. So if I say a loan is non-amortizing, what does it mean then? Do you get non-amortizing loans?
you will get bulk payment at the end.
That's right. It's a bullet payment or bulk payment. There's another type of non-amortizing loan that you have. Not a loan, but a product.
Zero coupon bond.
Yes, but more simple than that. Overdraft. It's not technically a term loan, but if you look at overdraft that the bank gives a client, you're not sure what the repayment in that is going to be and how much is going to be drawn down. So it's very much a floating thing, right? So you can't predict tomorrow it will be fully drawn, tomorrow, day after it might be fully paid up. Or the guy could be paying in stages, yeah? So your amortization schedule, you can't predict on that. So basically, amortizing loan is where you know there are repayments in between, and you know what those repayments schedule is looking like, or what it should be like. You can sort of schedule out at the beginning, so you know what the amortization is over a period of time. So look at this example on slide number 19. There's a $10,000 loan in 4 equal payments. Each payment has a principal plus interest. What will appear in each bucket? So we have 4 columns there: 1 year, 2 to 3 years, 4 to 10 years, and then the total. So first and foremost, what you have to look at the simple thing here. Okay, let's look at the next one. So these are the components, right? So the interest rate on the loan is 10%. Yeah. We know that the present value of that, what we are giving out, is 10,000 because we are giving a loan for 10,000 today. So that's basically the present value of that loan. We know that the number of payments is 4. Yeah. So now what we are asking is at a 4% interest, right? And where there is a repayment period of 4 years, right? What will the with the interest added in, how long will we take, or what will the monthly payment work out to for a transaction like this? Yeah. So looking at the formula, just keep the formula in your mind for a second. But let's go back into the schedule itself, right? So what is it showing you here, right? It's basically showing you on the schedule itself that the payment that you have to make monthly is 3,155. Now let's simplify this a bit. For 10,000 rupees at 10% interest, right, per annum, what's the interest you have to pay? Let's look at it very simply. 10,000 rupees, 10% interest. What's the interest you have to pay every year? For 10,000 rupees for at 10% interest, what's the annual interest amount you have to pay?
1,000.
1,000 rupees. So does that change? Let's say 1,000 rupees change. Remember, this is amortizing loan. So will that 1,000 rupees change every year?
Yes.
Yes. Why will it change every year?
Because when it come to close to maturity, like interest portion will reduce.
Okay. That's correct. But if you look at it, if it's 10,000 when it starts, it's amortizing loan, we said, right? So every year, what is there on the principal? What are we doing with the principal?
Is going to reduce.
Reduce. So what is 10,000 today at the start of next year will be a lesser amount. So the interest is calculated then based on the
Closing balance.
On the closing balance. So the interest every year will change, right? So we start off with 1,000, but we know next year interest is going to be less, right? Then basically the repayment. Now we started with the repayment of, we'll say 2,000, whatever, right? Now next year, what's going to happen with the repayment? Ideally, the repayment should not change. Repayment should be the same. We are deducting the principal every year. However, when a bank structures a loan, it does it in such a way that it keeps the same payment throughout the period. You all know that, right? So the same installment is maintained throughout the period of the loan. So now we understand that the interest component keeps reducing, right? And then if the interest component keeps reducing, then ideally what should happen to the loan installment every year, assuming the loan total repayment every year, if the interest is reducing, ideally what should be happening? What should be happening with the repayment every year? It should be if we are saying that the installment is equal, that the principal installment is equal, the amount of the principal we pay is equal, okay, then ideally when every year when you reset the loan, if with the interest rate and the principal has come down, interest rates have the interest value we pay has come down. If the principal is an equal installment over time, ideally the monthly installment in total we have to be has to be less. But it doesn't happen that way because the bank will keep a same installment throughout the term of the loan. They don't change that. What happens is what changes inside that. What are those components? The interest component and the principal repayment component keep changing, right? So in other words, what's happening is the amount of interest the client is paying is coming down amount-wise. The rate is the same, but the amount keeps coming down. And the amount of principal he is repaying keeps increasing over time. Is that understood?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So looking at the schedule here, like I said, leave the math out of it for a second. Based on this formula, which is present value, interest rates, the number of the period, and when you simplify this formula, you get a perm payment here. So what I want you all to do next week, is to plug in this data into this formula. Yeah. And on an Excel or, if you have it's a very simple thing. You basically plug in this formula to these data points, right? A being the amount that you have to basically pay monthly, and to arrive at what A is. The answers you should get is this, 3155, right? So what are we saying here? Every year for the next 4 years, for a 10,000 rupee loan, your installment plus interest works out to 3,155. Yeah. And if you break that up for the first year, it means it's 1,000 plus 2,155 is the total. How that breakup of this plus this comes. Now here, this is simple for the first year. You know that 1,000 is the interest component, so the remaining amount is the principal. Ideally, if you had a 10,000 rupee loan with no interest payments, what would your installment be for a year? 0 coupon. What would your principal? So 0 interest charge, non-interest bearing loan that you have given. What would your interest repayment be? Principal repayment have been?
2,500.
Exactly. Now, because you're paying interest, you have to pay the interest. So now your first year's principal is only interest is 1,000. Now the question is, when it comes to the second year, what do you think? Without going into the numbers, what do you think your interest would be? How much? So we know the closing balance is 7,845, correct? We know the closing balance is 7,845. 7,844. So how much do you think the interest for that is?
780.
700 sorry. 784 is the interest. And then you know that your installment is 3,155. So then how much is your principal then? How much is the principal piece? We have a calculator there. You can work it out. This minus this.
2,370.50.
So, what is this saying here? Interest has gone down, principal has gone up. Right? And then when you come 3,155, then from 7,845, so you carry forward 7,845. How much do you minus from that for the next term?
5,474.50.
So you minus this, right? Correct? What did you say? 5,000?
474.50.
5,000.
Maybe 475.
So basically, your principal has gone down at the end of the second year to 5,475. Like I said, if it's non-interest bearing, this would have been 5,000 by the end of 2 years. So you go on like that. And then at the end of it, at the 4-year bucket, you will have a higher repayment than 2.5, and your 10 years will be done. And you would have paid your interest also. What you are learning here is this 3,555 is a constant. It doesn't change. But this components within keep shifting around. Now, the only other way this can have an impact is, now we are working on 10% interest here constantly. If your interest is being repriced every year, now here we are saying 10%, right? Then what happens? Do we know every year is going to be 10%? No. Next year could be 15%. Then what happens? Then what happens? So, for example, this you know your interest is going to be 10%, you know this is, so you know what it is, right? But if you're pricing of something that has a floating like component, yeah, then does your installment remain static? If you have already agreed the term, you know it's 5 years, 4 years, right? That term doesn't change. So you know you have to pay off the loan in 4 years' time. Agreed? But now your interest is not fixed anymore. It's floating. Then does your installment remain the same? You understand the question, right? Now here the interest rate is 10% for 4 years. Okay? That's clear. It doesn't change. So you know this is going to be the same. Now I'm telling you this interest rate is no longer 10% for 4 years. It's 10% for the first year. And then second year, it could be a different rate, whatever. It could be 15% in the second year, 5% in the third year. Okay, now, can I keep the installment the same? But the loan is for 4 years. That doesn't change. Still a 4-year loan. You can't extend the tenor of the loan. How do I manage that then? How do I manage that? The interest rate difference has to go into the installment. So you are not no longer, if it has gone up 5%, no longer is it going to be 3155. It will be whatever 3135, 3500. So you have an interest rate risk. That's what you call interest rate risk. So in other words, because the tenor of your loan is not changing, if the tenor of a loan also has changed, then some of that burden you can take on by extending the tenor. But what you're saying here is, look, it's not 10% the second year, it's 15% the second year. So in other words, I have to now calculate my interest based on 15%. Then I have to plug in the data into my formula and say, okay, for 15% for the next remaining period, what should my installment look like, right? And then I have to say for that period, okay, 15%, this is the principal I'm paying, this is the additional interest I have to pay, right? So the installment then will not be the same. The installment will change then. Is that clear?
Yes, but when it comes to this formula, what is A stand for?
A is the amount of the this 3,155. That's what you're looking for. Is that right? Let me see. No, the amount of the loan. Sorry. No, sorry. When I say A is the payment period. Sorry, the PV is the amount of the loan. So 10,000 is what you're giving today. R is the rate. N is the number of the years. And A represents the 3155. So that is what you're looking for, basically. In this question, this is what you're looking for, 3155. So if you were to put 3155 divided by 0.1, which is the rate, and solve for that what's in the brackets, you should get 10,000. Is that clear? Is this clear? Because this, remember, this is based on a term loan where your interest is fixed. That's very important to understand. Okay, so we prepare the loan schedule, and now coming to where we want to sort of get to, where does this repayment of assets or whatever, sit in your allocation in terms of when you allocate your receivables, right, over a period of time, which bucket will it sit in? So we know that the first year, 2155, which is pretty straightforward. Your assets get repaid, that particular assets gets repaid at 2155 in the first year. In the second and third year, you'll find that it's 2977. So the addition between the second and third years principals collected. And then in the fourth year, and up to the 5-10 years, so basically in the fourth year, you'll have a collection of 2868 coming in your books. And then the total assets will be repaid to you over a period of time. At 10,000 will be repaid over that period of time. So it's basically showing you between 4 and 5 years, you'll have 2858, 2868 or whatever. 4 and 10 years, basically in the 4 years, and this is the rest of the profile. So you can see that the majority of your assets are getting paid back in the second and third years, 2977. And that's where your assets are sort of reducing, your client's commitment to you is reducing, and your asset allocation is reducing for that particular loan in that bucket. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, so before we go into that, how do you handle bonds? How would you look at it from a price of a treasury bond? So what is a bond? Let's go to the basics. What's a bond? What is a bond? What's a bond? What is a bond? What's a bond? Okay, so bond is a long-term instrument in the market. It's a capital market instrument that is used for people to make their long-term asset allocations, funding, investments, what you want to call it, and to also be able to raise long-term assets. So, for example, if I have excess money, if I'm an insurance company who has excess funds, I would like to make sure, because my commitments to my policyholders are based on me being able to earn a certain amount of return over a period of time, but also for me to be able to make sure that because I have to make these payments out continuously, I need to make sure I have a certain amount of funds available at any given time to make my policyholders' requirements. Having said that, if it's say a guy who does life insurance, he doesn't need to have all his money available within 6 months, 1 year, 12 months. He has to make sure that he has the right mix of short-term assets and long-term assets so that he maximizes on the return for his shareholders, for his policyholders, right? So he is always looking, and if you're a 30-year-old who takes a life policy, and his majority of his insurers are 30-year-olds, we just take it that way, yeah. yeah, there might be a few unfortunate people who might not survive for 30 years, but he has to think of the fact that the majority of his life policy holders are going to be there for at least 30 more years, 40 more years living wise. So he doesn't need to pay them out anything for that period. While they keep paying him monthly premiums, annual premiums, he keeps getting, right? Which basically is telling you, okay, I am collecting this money that I don't need right now, majority of it. So what does he need to do? He needs to go out there and put it in a long-term instrument that will give him ability to fix his interest rates that he's getting, as well as give him like a asset that he knows is on his book for a longer period of time, and that he doesn't have to keep looking to reinvest, but mainly on the rates. So a lot of investors look for bonds to invest their long-term money into, right? That way, they make sure that they are sort of fixing their excess funds in their books for a good period of time. Now, when a bond comes out, there are various kinds of bonds. There could be zero coupon bonds, there could be coupon bonds, right? When you say zero coupon bonds, what are you saying? There is nothing, no payment in between. You buy the bond here on day 0, you buy it here, right, at say 100. And then at the end of the period, you will get 120. 120, sorry, 120. Just assuming that that is the, so you pay 100 for it and you get 120 for it. That's it. Yeah. That's a zero. If you have a coupon bearing bond, you buy it here at 0. This is 0 coupon. Okay. If you have a 6-month coupon, we'll say at 10%, 10%, 10%. Yeah. Sorry. So then you pay, we'll say 100 right here. The value of the bond or the face value of what you're buying might be, we'll say at par, so you're buying it say 100. So every month, every 6 months, you will get 10% per annum. So you will get 5, you get 5, you get 5, and you get 5. Yeah. So instead of getting 120 at the end, which is zero coupon, you will get 5 over a period of time. It's not as simple as this, because the price you pay here will be determined on where the market yields are, what the market is trading at. So if you have a bond that is a notional of 100 million or 100, and it has a coupon of 10, you will see what the market rate yields are for it, and then decide how much you have to pay here for these bonds. So you might not pay 100 for the 100 notional, you might pay 90 for it, or you might pay 110 for it. What you pay for here will be based on this, and where the YTM is, yield to maturity of the bond is. Yeah. Basically, what you're saying is what the market value of the bond is. Is it 10%, 9%, 8%, 6%, what, right? And then you pay what you call the price here, what you call the dirty price in bond language, to buy the bond. When you buy it here, you hold on to it. Your interest is calculated based on the face value at the end of it, and you get paid here, right? So now the question here is zero coupon bond, right? You have to show what you have purchase price and what the interest accruing is in that appropriate bucket. So for example, you buy it now, you have interest accruing of 120. This is the purchase price. You have a 2-year bond at the maturity at 120. So that's your asset for that particular bond in that period. That's it. Any questions? If it's not clear, please tell me. Happy to go through it again. Did you do the lesson on fixed income already? On bonds and fixed income? Bond calculations and stuff like that?
Yes, we did.
You did. So you did the bond pricing and how the coupons are looked at and stuff like that, right?
Yes.
Was that covered? Did Nishant cover that already?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. So for this purpose, what you're trying to figure out is where do you plug a zero coupon bond? Because the reason is it's like a loan. It's like same as a loan, where whether you buy a bond or you give a loan, you're creating an asset on your books. So it's just about where the cash flows are and how you basically account for those cash flows in your asset and liability mix. So now we are going to jump into liabilities. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cover the liabilities piece and I'm going to stop it there because I think there's a lot to absorb, and we will do the remaining next week along with the next one because I feel that I just want to give you guys some time to digest this as well, and we will probably cover a bit more in terms of sums later. But let's work on the liabilities bit and then we will stop there for today. Okay, so we've discussed the bonds, we've discussed the assets, but let's look at the liabilities, okay? So what is a liability? A deposit, right? So we have different kinds of liabilities. We have deposits, we have certificates of deposits, etc. And we have to basically show the liabilities in the maturity bucket it is, which is what we discussed earlier. Okay, so there are contractual liabilities and there are non-contractual. So contractual is, like I said, the certificates of deposits and things like that that has a term commitment, and the others that have that are non-like savings accounts. So, for example, like I said earlier, if somebody comes and deposits money in your current account or in a savings account, interest bearing or not interest bearing current account, non-interest bearing current account, or a savings account, you will then have this load of liabilities in your books, but you're not sure when it's going to go because there's no contractual obligation from the depositor to keep it for a certain period of time. So you know that you are suddenly sitting on a big deposit, but it can go even tomorrow, right? So how do you determine on those kinds of liabilities that are in your book? How do you determine what bucket you have to put these things into? What would you think is the best way of doing it? You understand the questions, right? Now you have your liabilities that you know are going to be there for 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever, right? Those if the depositor wants to take it out, there's a penalty, he has a premature upliftment cost, all those things are there. So if you are now sitting on a deposit that can go out anytime, yeah, and you're saying yourself, okay, fine, how do I, how can I say this? How do I figure out how much of this deposit I should allocate for each bucket? How can I sort of rationalize this? How would you do it?
By looking at the maturity,
But there's no maturity. It's savings accounts, savings and current accounts balances. How would you know the maturity?
by looking at the trend, the withdrawal, the trend, like what do you call,
Look at a trend. Okay,
on
very
what
good. Okay.
on what frequency, like trend.
Yeah. So you look at a trend.
Trend
Yeah. Okay.
basically a withdrawal trend, like how frequently they withdraw, something like that.
Yes, very good. So you look at your past trends. You look at, okay, for a period of, 1 year or whatever the period might be, right? That you have had of your savings balances, yeah, it has been something like 50 million all the time. Now, right now you have 75 million, but if you look at an average, statistically a weighted average basis, your balances have been 50 million, right? For the 3 months bucket. And you have another 50 million in the 6 months bucket, another amount in the 1 year, depending on how much you have, right? You will then look at all that and say, okay, fine. Based on that, based on my trend analysis, statistical basis, this is the place I want to put my, these are the buckets I want to allocate for my different liabilities. Now, is this a perfect science? Is this a perfect science?
No.
No, it's not, right? So a lot of banks will adopt different strategies for this. They call it different things. Some people call it behavioralization. Some people call it sort of a, I think it's like rationalizing of their deposit base, whatever you want to call it. So there is no perfect science. So what the bank will do is, it's very unique to each bank also. There could be some banks who have a lot of sticky liabilities, where what we say sticky means they are there for a long time. People don't take the money out. It's just sitting in savings accounts or even current accounts. There could be banks that have very fast movement funds for whatever reason, based on the type of clients they deal with. So there is no exact model or basis on which the bank. So what the ALCO has to do, it has to stick and say, okay, fine, let's look at our liability book, okay, and then they will discuss what we call the transfer pricing mechanism based on this as well. So not only for the purpose of determining your assets and liability mix for the sake of cash flow management, but also for the purpose of managing your transfer pricing, you will also have this thing where you sort of behavioralize to see, okay, my liabilities for are mostly in my deposit savings and current account deposits. I have an average of 50 million in the 3 months bucket. So the business will come and say, okay, don't pay me overnight rates for those liabilities. Come and pay me the 3-month rate for that, instead of paying me the overnight rate. Because you have this, you can see that you have always got about 50 million, that is average 3 months. Pay me the 3-month rate. I don't want the overnight rate. Why? Because the overnight rate must be lower than the 3-month rate. So the personal banking people might say, give me the 3-month rate, T-bill rate. I don't want the overnight rate when you're buying my liabilities in. And that discussion can happen in the bank. And the Treasury might say, yes, okay, I understand. That sounds reasonable enough. I'll give it. Or they say, no, I'm sorry. I can't pay you the 3-month rate because between the 5 and the 3 month, there's a 3% difference. And yes, you might have this situation now, but I can't pay you that. So I might pay you 3-month treasury bills minus 50 basis points or 100 basis points. Now that is a discussion that you have once you sit around the table in ALCO, right? And based on your profile like this as well. That's not relevant at this person, but I'm telling you that's another reason that you will have this discussion around how you bucket the non-contractual maturities like savings and current accounts. Is that clear? Okay, let me go to the next one. Now, prepayments. Now, that is another thing. Now, what is a prepayment? What is a prepayment? What is a prepayment? You have given a loan to somebody, 5 years, equal installments, interest rate is known, everything is fine. But suddenly he comes and tells you after 2 years, look, I want to pay this off. Okay, now you created an asset on your book for 5 years. This guy wants to settle the asset in 2 years. Is that a prepayment? Yes or no?
Yes.
It is. Now, is there a risk to the bank by the prepayment? Is there a where are the risks to the bank in terms of the repayment?
Although the loan like outstanding is repay, but we have to pay for the liability. I mean the deposit. Deposit might take for 4 year period.
Yeah.
Loan would also would have given for something like that.
Okay, fair enough. But how if I tell you yes, there is, so you don't say your liabilities are there on your book, yes. So how do you value the risk of the prepayment to the bank? How would you determine what the impact to the bank is based on the prepayment made?
Reinvestment risk.
Exactly. Very good. So what is reinvestment risk?
The amount that we receive by settling this amount, we have to reinvest at a current market level. Then current market rate may not be same as the contractual rate.
Exactly. So we say we've lent for 5 years. Okay. After 2 years, he comes back and says he wants to repay it after 2 years. Which basically means how repay. How many years more to go? If he is repaying after 2 years, how many more years to go? 5-year loan, 15% interest.
3
If
years.
he's repaying after 2 years, how many more years to go? 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah. 3 years. Now, if this is an amortizing loan, say we've given 100 million. Yeah, at the end of 3 years, there is 80 million. Okay, so you just mentioned replacement costs at whatever. Now, we have created an asset for 15% on our book for 5 years. We've had that asset for 2 years. Now, somebody is saying, I'm going to pay you back, so I'm going to lose that asset. Correct? Yes or no? I'm going to lose the asset now. Yeah. So now, when I go and try to plug that hole in my balance sheet, which period am I looking at for what amount am I looking at? Which period am I looking at? For how much am I looking at? Am I looking for 5 years, 100 million? Or am I looking for 3 years for 80 million? Or am I looking 3 years for 100 million? What is my risk? Where is my risk?
Three years.
Yes, 3 years. Amount 100 million or 80 million?
80 million.
80 million. So now I have 3 years risk, 80 million. Now I need to figure out how do I value my risk? At what rate? What rate do I use? This loan has been given at 15%, but that's not worth anything now. We might have charged him a prepayment risk and all that. That's fine with him. We have to look at it against the 3-year rate. Current 3-year rate is 10%. So now what has happened to me? Because this guy is uplifting and he is repaying, interest rates have come down. I'm losing 5% on the asset I've created. 5, 10. For the remaining 3 years, I have deficit by 10. So ideally, what I have to be doing is this 5% per annum, I have to charge him. Unless there are other conditions that have been put there as a flat fee or whatever it is the bank calls. But ideally, because why is it, what is the client doing? He can easily go out there now, pay my 100 million loan and go and borrow at 10% himself for 3 years and lower his interest cost, right? So yes, he'll pay me a 5% difference for the next 3 years, but he can go out and borrow 10% himself again. So when it comes to prepayments, we have to see whether the client's intention, what the client's intentions are. Obviously, look at the client relationship, all those things together. But we have to see whether the intention is to go and refinance somewhere else cheaper. If he's refinancing cheaper, that means definitely, and he has fixed the rate with us, he has a benefit. The bank is losing by him taking up early, then the bank has to consider charging him. Bank usually should charge the 5% difference. If the intention is because of a genuine reason where he has got excess cash in his hand, he doesn't need it, then it's a business call to see whether you want to actually still charge it or not. But moreover, what you have to understand is there is a financial impact to the bank by doing this, right? Because you have raised and gone and put an asset on your book, and now because of you have to replace the remaining 3 years with a 10% asset, definitely there is an impact to the bank. Is that clear? Okay, so now coming back to our lesson, you have to basically estimate the prepayment. Now you don't know what these prepayments will be. Let's put it that way. It's like the liabilities side of it, where you don't know when people will withdraw the money from a deposit. You have no clue when this can happen. You don't know. It could happen tomorrow. It could never happen, right? So what you are trying to see here is you have to estimate based on your institution's past experience. Yeah. And then based on that, you have to compute, like you did for the liabilities, the amount of principal that will be repaid for each period based on estimate, purely estimate. Then you basically plug those assumptions in to the balances at the beginning of each year. Basically look at the schedule and then look at the unscheduled. So it's an estimate you make to understand of your assets, how much you have, will get paid back, and what your assumption is on the prepayments that could happen. Estimate of prepayments that could happen. And then you plug it in and say, okay, this is where my asset profile will look like based on this. Now, what you have to understand is it's again an estimate. What you can do is your estimate on both the liability side as well as this, it could be also colored by or influenced by your interest rate view. Like what I just said. If you feel that interest rates are going to go down in the future, right? And there you have a lot of fixed rate loans on your books. Depending on how you contracted with your clients, you can assume that some of your clients might actually come back if interest rates go down and look to repay your loans, because now they can go and finance it cheaper. With you or with somebody else at a shorter term, they can finance it cheaper. So based on your view on interest rates also, you can sort of go out and say, oh, all right, okay, I don't know how much of prepayments can come, it can change, but if interest rates come down aggressively and I put in assets that are fixed, my clients might come out and tell you, look, I want to prepay. Look at the situation right now, at the current situation in Sri Lanka, around the world, right? Interest rates are at historic lows, right? Don't you think that clients who can finance cheaper somewhere else, either in another currency or in the same currency but with a different institution, would go out depending on the terms of their contract and look to resettle some of their high interest bearing loans? So do you think the prepayments in terms of assets is higher now than before? What do you think? It should ideally be higher now, but it depends on how much of fixed loans people have taken, fixed term interest rate loans people have taken. But it should ideally be higher because interest rates are low and people can generate funds now at a much lower interest rate now. So that also can come into some of your, when you make your estimate as to what your, so in other words, you have to have a very close eye on where interest rates are and how interest rates will behave. Okay, any questions before I go to the next one? All right. So next one is on how to handle off-balance sheet items. So what is an off-balance sheet item? Can somebody tell me that first? What is an off-balance sheet item?
It's a contingent liability.
Sorry, I didn't hear you. What was that?
Contingent liability, which may occur on the occurrence of few events in the future times.
Exactly. So you're not sure whether it's going to happen or not. It's contingent on something happening. So give me an example of a contingent liability to make it easy, everybody.
Bank guarantee.
Bank guarantee, very good. Something else?
Letter of credit.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So going out of the bank, if it's a company, what's a contingent liability for a company? Even for a bank to extend, but some companies who bid for things, say tenders, for example. If you put a tender in and your tender gets accepted a while, that becomes a contingency for you, right? So for a contingent liability on the off balance is where you're not sure whether that particular product or offering or whatever you want to call it will actually ever get triggered. Triggering of it will be dependent on certain factors. It could be market rates. It could be certain conditions being met. So for a bank, you have, like you said, the guarantees and business like that. You also have products like the interest rate swaps that you have, where you might be hedging a client's interest exposure or another bank's interest exposure, where you enter into separate products where you tell them, look, I will pay you fixed of X amount and you pay me floating of X amount, something like that. Yeah. Now, that is contingent on the difference that you pay will be contingent on where the interest rates are at that particular point in time. Sometimes you could have even like these options that you have on your book, where the optionality being exercised is based on a certain market movement. If that happens, you have a certain amount of liability that you have to meet, certain commitment you have to meet. But you don't know whether that will happen or not. So all those items gets listed as a contingent on your balance sheet. Yeah. Now, how you represent it, in this case, for example, they are given an example on slide number 27 of a swap, interest rate swap. where the notional is 100 million, where you're fixing a 10% fixed rate for it on your deposit that you have taken, and you're receiving the 6-month SLIBOR rate in this case, and it's a 5-year maturity. So the unknown factor here is you don't know how much the SLIBOR component that you're going to get is, right? And there is a notional, so there is no actual physical deposit here. It's just that you're managing to fix your interest rates on your deposit that you have borrowed at 10%, and you know basically that you have a fixed liability for a period of time for a particular amount. It does not boost your balance sheet in terms of liability side, but it gives you certainty in terms of the interest rate side. So what you do is, it depends also, now in this case, yeah, okay. So principal on this could be exchanged every at the end of the period or not, or it could be just purely notional on everything. So in this case, in order to represent your liability on your asset book, right, you have a liability that is shown because you're fixed for 5 years in the 5-year bucket for 100 million, because you know that is where you have an asset liability on a book for 5 years for which you're paying a 10% fixed rate. So there you go. My assets 100 million I have already hedged at a 10% interest rate, and then you liability, and then you have an asset which you show every 6 months because that's a floating rate. So that asset is being repriced every 6 months. So if SLIBOR is say 5% today, it gets repriced at 5% for 6 months. If it goes up to 10% in the next 6 months, it gets repriced at 10%. If it goes up to 15%, it gets repriced at 15%. So your liability will move with the interest rate. Your asset will be fixed. So because your asset is fixed, your liability is fixed, your asset is moving, your liability will be fixed in the 5-year bucket, and your asset will be floating based on the movement in the 6 months. So you keep it in the 6-month bucket there. So like that, you have to look at the contingency that you have on your books. Is it the asset? Is it a liability? But you have to look at the contingency that you have and then plug it in based on the period you have it for and what kind of commitment that you have for that particular asset or liability. Is that clear? Okay. Yeah. Good question. Okay. So next slide is 28. We are talking about the various methods of managing a multi-currency balance sheet. One is to have a consolidated GAAP report, or other one is to have a individual GAAP report. So when you have a consolidated one, you would still need to translate it into a home currency, and then basically have a currency risk hedge built into it so that you understand how it works. So it's just a way of reporting it, and if you have a GAAP report for each currency, you will have a lot of reports. Yeah. And if you have a multitude of currencies that you're dealing with, and then you have a report for each and every GAAP, it truly wouldn't mean anything. So most people would have, based on each currency, and then they'll consolidate it into one. And say, for example, in US dollars or whatever the currency might be, they'll have one report, and they'll make assumptions on which currency, the exchange rate they're using for that particular assumption, and say, okay, based on that, these are gaps. So what it's trying to say is, look, yes, you can have all kinds of currencies, but at the end of the day, for visual and for interpretation and for ease of use, it's good to have it in one currency with the assumption on the exchange rates that are being used for it. So that is meaningful. So this is just summarizing what we learned in the morning about increase in interest rates and how it will have an impact on NII. So we are saying if it's a positive gap, interest rates go up, it's good for NII. Negative gap, interest rates go up, it's bad for NII, and vice versa. So positive gap is where you have basically short-term assets on your book, and therefore if interest rates go up, you gain on the increase in the interest rates, and the other way around. So it's just basically giving you a summary of what we discussed in the morning. So this is the final one that I want to touch on today, and then we will stop for the day. And we'll continue on from next week because I understand there's a lot of content in the next ones which I want to touch on separately, and then go into the questions around that. And we should be able to finish all that next week. Now, let me just do this bit first. So impact on NII. So we know what the impact on interest because of interest rate movement is on the net interest income. But remember, the interest necessarily can be different based on the type of buckets and how the interest rates move. So for example, so you have assets, you have liabilities, you have 100, 50, 50, 50, 100 and 150, and then you have 200 and 3 months, 6 months, we'll say 9 months, and we'll say 12 months. Okay. Now, interest rates go, we'll say interest rates go down by 150 basis points. So interest rates go down by 50 basis points lower rates. Okay. Right. Now interest rates go down by 50 basis points. What happens? What happens? So you have more assets here, less liabilities here. More assets, less assets here, also equal here. More assets here, less assets here, more liabilities here. So ideally, then you take the cumulative and say, okay, fine, cumulative, you might be the same. It might be neutral, right? Whatever. But at the end of the day, the impact on NII, what we said, if interest rates go down, what is the impact on NII? If interest rates go down, if you have a positive gap where you basically have more liabilities than assets, right? More liabilities than assets. Ideally, what should happen? You should lose money because interest rates have gone down. Yeah, your assets are less. So if you look at a cumulative here, you have 50 more assets. You have nothing here. You have more liabilities here, and you have more liabilities. So from a cumulative basis, you have more liabilities. So in other words, you have more liabilities than you have assets. So in other words, you are what? You are positive gap. Yeah. So positive gap, interest rates go down. ideally you should be losing money because interest rates have gone down. You have more liabilities than you have assets. Therefore, you should lose money because you have not enough assets allocated. Your assets are all getting repriced on the short term. Yeah? However, when you look at this, what do you see? You realize that you have 200 million assets sitting on your 12-month bucket. Yeah? And you have 100 in this one as well. Yeah? Sorry, I've got it wrong here. Let's make this. Let's make this to make this minus 100. So we have 50 here, we have 0 there, we have 50 there. And we want to make it another minus 100. So we make it 200. Yeah. But you realize that you have some assets here, right? And you have some liabilities over here, right? Now you've got to figure out, just because interest rates have gone down, does it mean that the impact on all your assets over a period is going to be the same? It's not, right? Because even if interest rates go down by 50 basis points, because of the impact on the yield curve over here, right? You could have this interest rate for this period going down only by 20 basis points or 25 basis points, although they've cut 50 basis points here. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is a decrease in interest rates or an increase in interest rates, whatever it might be, does not have the same impact on NII across the board. Yeah, because there are mismatches in each bucket. Assets, and then assets might be towards the end of the bucket. Liabilities might be towards the beginning of the bucket. It depends, right? The rate, and then if you have the interest changing, right, it doesn't mean that the interest rate change across the board is going to be the same. So if 50 basis points is cut today, doesn't mean that the yield curve will drop by the same value over across the whole yield curve, right? And then there's basis risk. In other words, where you will put your T-bills at one basis, and then the other products will be at a different basis in terms of how you calculate it. And then you have could be assets that are there that could be running off the book anyway, right? So the impact of interest rates, even if you have a big asset on your book and then interest rates come down, it could be actually leaving your profile soon. So it could have an impact only for a short period of time. So then interest income, net interest income that you're looking at is not purely looked at based looking at your assets and liability mix. You can say, okay, I have X amount of positive or negative gap. So therefore, interest rates going down or going up or whatever is good for me. You can't. You have to look at each bucket and then determine at the end of that, this is what your actual situation will be based on the profile that you have, assets and liability profile, the entire profile that you have. And then look at the impact on the yield curve. The yield curve is very important because it then tells you what the impact on each of those buckets are based on that change. Okay, I'm just going to leave it there for the moment. Any questions? On what we discussed today? Okay, great. So just to be clear, next week we will look to finish off the bit on how you estimate this impact. And then we will also look to look at the limitations and advantage of gap analysis, and then basically touch on a few questions that are around it. A few things I think we will also touch on the next presentation, which has a bit of duration and complexity. I will not go into detail with that because I think that's already been discussed by Nishanta already. But if you have any questions around it, we can always address it there. My intention is to try and finish ALM by next week. I had allocated 4 weeks or 5 weeks for it, but depending on how it's taken up next week, we'll either do it this week, next week, and the following week. But it all depends on your feedback as to whether you want to refresh more, look into it more. If it's not, because we have some time around that. Then I'll ask Dishanta to start off from the following week on that. Are there any questions about today's or last week's or any of the content we've done so far? Okay.
When it comes to this gap analysis, like who's the one responsible at banks? Like, is it finance department guys or is it treasury guys? Like,
usually it's
for the
treasury.
both of.
No, it's usually treasury. Treasury does the analysis, and then because they do the fund allocation for bank, so based on that they look at it. But the data points for this will come from finance usually.
Okay. When it comes to ALCO, like.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sometimes, because there are conflicting requirements for the bank. So, for example, not conflicting, can I say conflict? It's various things that the bank requires, right? So, for example, you might want to give client loans instead of putting money into treasury bills, for example. Or you have to allocate your assets in different ways. Or the guy who's raising the deposits might prefer to raise 5-year deposits, but the treasury guy will say, look, we can't pay you a high rate for 5-year deposits. Yeah. So there could be conflicting situations like that. So that discussion happens at ALCO as well as to where the bank would like its profile and what are the bases on which they would decide on one particular profile over other as well. But the day-to-day discussions around day-to-day operational side of it, how you manage it, what you do, how you manage your liquidity, etc., that is done by Treasury in consultation with finance. Okay, if nothing else, is there anything else?
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, and we'll start off next week, like I said, and then see how it goes, and then decide whether we are going for another week or not. If not, we can look to complete ALM by next week. If not, like I said, please do ask questions. If not, it's difficult for me to gauge your level of understanding until we do the assignment later on. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.